Welcome to the Aftra podcast, the podcast who has not received a name yet. We are with us Níels Ingi Jónason. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm a security engineer. Been in the security field for about 6 years now, and got really lucky and got my first job in security engineering at Icelandic consultancy called Syntis. Enjoyed my time there. Was ready to try something else. Got again super lucky and had a chance to work for an American company called Lacework. Ended up working there for just over a year when it got bought, and they ended up closing the Icelandic offices. And at that point was kind of a stars aligned moment. I, as well as 4 other colleagues, we were all unemployed at the same time, so we decided to start a company, our own consultancy.
Okay. So what were you doing at Lacework?
At Lacework, I was part of the internal security team, specifically the application security team. And it was the application security team was quite small, so we were only 2 engineers. But the security team at Lacework was somewhat large, and we had some super talented people in the other aspects of security, so like GRC and ProdSec.
Okay. Were you performing something like pen tests or application security reviews on the internal code or on vendor code as well?
Yeah. So yeah, it's focusing on internal code, and it's more like focused on preemptive approaches. So putting up tooling in place that prevents the vulnerabilities from showing up in the first place, and then also the kind of more review-based approach where there's a new feature being launched, we need to review it for vulnerabilities, and also, like you mentioned, vendors. So Lacework bought some companies and some solutions that had to be reviewed, and there's also the more systemic approach. So you realize okay, we have this problem X, we need to get rid of it. So it's more like security at scale.
So this is not, it's not very typical for an Icelandic company to employ that kind of level of security in their, deployment pipeline. How does that work? When do you review? Do you review every piece of change, or does somebody make a decision to do that?
It can be for a multitude of reasons. So it can be that the engineering team that developed the feature is asking for a security review because they realize okay, this is something security sensitive and we kind of need extra pair of eyes on this. It could also be further up the chain where someone decides okay, before we go and make this public, we actually need security people to check this out. And then there might be some compliance issues which require this to be reviewed, and other possible reasons for the review to take place.
Okay. So from my experience, you can have something like a code owner of a particular maybe tech stack that has to approve a pull request or a code change before it's merged. Is there anything of that nature in terms of security?
Yes, there is. It depends on how mature the security team of the company is. So if you're more mature, you have a well-defined process in place where it's these are the things that need to be checked off by the security team. So then the security engineers are also essentially, as you mentioned, code owners to specific features and specific code.
Okay, so I'm guessing you learned quite a lot, but you were only there for a year.
Yeah.
But what happens then?
What happens then? Yeah, like I mentioned, was bought. The company that bought us didn't see value in having Icelandic offices, which is very understandable. So we were at least 3 of us colleagues there were unemployed, and then another colleague recently quit their job, and another one recently decided to try something else. So we were 5 in total who kind of came together and realized, okay, we have a shot at starting our own kind of consultancy.
Okay. So there's 5 of you, cybersecurity specialists in Iceland. So I would say a majority of the cybersecurity professionals in Iceland, all at the same time, you have this opportunity, and you form a company. What is it called? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, we form a company called Ambaga, which is an Icelandic word for a grammar error. So it's a play on words with in programming you have programming languages. So a grammar error in a language is essentially a bug. So we kind of use that as the Icelandic translation for a vulnerability.
Yeah, very clever.
Thank you.
It is very clever. Who came up with it?
It kind of happened naturally or kind of on accident. So when we first met and we're thinking of like, are we going to start our own company or not? We decided to have a meeting, and before the meeting, everyone was supposed to write down their thoughts on like, what is this supposed to be? What is this supposed to not be? And we all wrote it down in English, except for one of us who decided to translate everything and keep everything in Icelandic, and translated vulnerabilities to Amba. And he mentioned that word, and everyone kind of stopped and was like, "What is that word? What did you just say?" Because it's somewhat of a new translation.
Okay. Okay. So in Ambaga, what are kind of like your primary objectives with Ambaga? How is it different from other consultancies? And maybe does your experience at Lacework influence that at all?
Yeah. I'd say the experience from Lacework and from 3 of us having worked as an internal security team, we kind of saw the return of investment on that. And in many ways, we're not doing a lot different. In many ways, it's much of the same, but what the main idea is and kind of what we want to start, which is somewhat new on the Icelandic market, is we want to have a security team for hire. So like you mentioned before, there's not a lot of Icelandic companies that have internal security teams or internal security people, or if they do, it's usually just compliance focused, and it's usually just the CISO or CSO, nothing else. There's not any security engineers or anything, which is totally understandable because usually the ratio is like you have 100 engineers for every, or like you have 1 security engineer for every 100 engineers. And most Icelandic companies aren't at that size, so they don't require that, but they still require the security engineer. They just don't have the money or availability to actually hire an engineer for that full time. So we thought, what if they could rent a security engineer? Maybe they just need 1/4 of a security engineer.
Okay, so in a lot of these fairly recent compliance frameworks or regulatory frameworks such as NIS and some others, DORA, we talk a lot about supply chain. So from the way that I understand it as a former software person, the way that you work is you're doing security reviews directly on the sort of software supply chain. So in your own words, what is a supply chain?
I think the the joke is kind of like what isn't the supply chain is more uh, like everyone understands it differently, and everyone thinks of something different when they think of the supply chain. So maybe a software engineer might think of their dependencies, or a person that's importing foods thinks of the like food supply chain, or just their single supplier. Maybe they don't go further than that. Um, so I think it's like, yeah, kind of the what isn't the supply chain is.
So, by the way, we're referencing also, you were a speaker at UTMS on an Icelandic security conference, and your topic was the supply chain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the supply chain has to be protected, right? That's something that they write in these frameworks.
Yeah.
So let's target it a little bit differently. What is it in terms of software? How do you look at it?
So here in Iceland, it's been a lot in the news, supply chain security, that suddenly everyone has to think about supply chain security due to the frameworks you mentioned, like NIS2 and DORA, because they mention that you have to do your best to secure your supply chain. And there was a lot of talk about it, and I felt like the discussion around supply chain security and supply chains, as it touches on software development, was somewhat misunderstood, um, because people were thinking more in terms of like physical supply chain security or operational supply chain security, and not so much on the security aspect and like where the hackers can actually break into the supply chain and become a part of the supply chain. But the way I look at the supply chain is it's a gigantic graph that just keeps growing at an exponential way. So it's not something that you alone just fix, because these frameworks say like you have to keep your supply chain as secure as possible. Uh, but the thing is, everyone is in everyone's supply chain. So what approach do you have to be able to secure your supply chain when much of the much of your supply chain isn't under your control? It's under someone else's control.
Yeah, absolutely, and that goes for your operational supply chain, your vendors, you can be an airline buying, I don't know, nails and tape, uh,
Yeah.
just the same way as you can be talking about some dependency in code, right? So the supply chain as a concept is way larger than I think most people realize.
Yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't make it any less important. I mean, you're supposed to keep it secure, or at least do your best, right?
Mhm.
So how do you do that?
So the way I've kind of talked about it in the talk I had is like normally the security approach with software and applications is it's kind of a you want to have a preemptive approach. You want to make sure that the vulnerabilities don't show up in the first place, and we want to like grab them as soon as possible, with the buzzword being like shift left security. Um, but in many ways, it's different for supply chain security because it's not always under your control. So it's more, in many ways, it's more reactive security. So it can require a different approach where you have to be more focused on hardening, more focused on response. How how can I make sure to make this as difficult as possible? Because I can't make it impossible, so I just have to make it as difficult as possible for someone to break this part of the chain. And then if someone breaks that part of the chain, how do I respond to it? How quickly can I respond to it? What logs do I have access to, and so forth?
Okay. So a little bit on sort of like the perception of the supply chain versus maybe the reality of it. Um, can you just with that go into a little bit what is the perception versus the reality of the supply chain?
Yeah, in many ways, I think the perception, um, especially for like laymen, is that you think that the supply chain is in many ways like the well-established supply chains of the physical world, like you mentioned, like manufacturing of airplanes and cars, which is usually like between companies, and you have these strong rules that you have to uphold, where you have to mention that like how something was manufactured, it has its own ID, you know exactly from which batch it is. So if anything goes wrong with some piece in some vehicle, you know exactly at what factory, where, and why. Possibly can figure out at least why it happened. But
Even chain of custody might be important
yeah, yeah.
for these parts. In general, sort of supply chain management, do you think that the origin is always known? The reason why I ask is, you know, in software, you may not go deep enough to actually know the origin of the like earliest bit of code that you're actually using.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I was going for, like comparing the two, because on one hand you have this where it's usually like business to business, so a company buys a part from another company, whilst in software it's usually like person to person. You have an engineer on your team that has an issue they have to solve, and they quickly discover that somebody else has already solved the issue and made it open source, and made it like available for you. And that engineer takes the decision, okay, I'm just gonna use this tool, and that's just some random person somewhere in the world, which has then full control of that software and is now a part of your supply chain.
Can you maybe talk about maybe some common or known vulnerabilities in supply chain in software that have been, you know, that have been found or have been catastrophic?
Yeah, there's, I guess, like the most well knowns that most software engineers are probably quick to think of are issues with the dependencies. So, and there's a lot that can go wrong there. So, I guess what most people are probably thinking of is known vulnerabilities in dependencies, which is a like today is a very easily solvable issue compared to the rest of the supply chain security. Um, but also with dependencies, you have the threat of, okay, I'm pulling a dependency from random person A somewhere in the world, and that person A got hacked, or their account to the packets registry got taken over, and now some random person B has access to that and has deployed malware, which is also very common, where people take over these packages and then deploy uh, some sort of cryptocurrency mining into the package. And then there's also the other threat that, okay, this person A might be in a country which is like suddenly in a war-torn country and decides like, okay, I'm gonna like do my best to remove this package for people from the like enemy state, and then causing kind of problems there.
So you're mentioning this, but maybe to simplify it a little bit. So can you just, what is the composition of modern software in terms of these packages? What are packages? How are they included? What does that mean for somebody that
Yeah,
may not understand code?
yeah. So the supply chain, and also the word supply chain, is very abstract, and kind of trying to make it more concrete can be difficult. But it's usually like it's been simplified, where it's first you have the developers, so that's a part of the supply chain. They have to write the code, so all the tools they're using, the text editors and such, are a part of the supply chain, and then they have to keep this code somewhere and has to be accessible to the entire team through some sort of a version control system, um, which is then a part of the software supply chain. And then you have to build the code, or compile it, which is then the compiler and the build system and everything that is part of that is now a part of the supply chain. And then once you've built the code or compiled the code, you have these artifacts, which is usually also what we call packages or dependencies. And these artifacts can either be like made available as a package and then included in other software. So then that's a part of the supply chain in that software, or it can be put forth into the runtime. So usually today it's in the cloud. So you add it in your runtime on the cloud, and then the cloud provider and everything regarding the runtime is also part of the supply chain.
In our case, we, for example, run almost all of our software in Amazon, which is running on some kind of like a Linux server or Linux-based lambdas. Those are, Linux is most of it is open source, or all of it. I'm not sure. And they are using all sorts of, commands and programs that may or may not have been written by just some random person on GitHub, right? So, and you mentioned this in your talk that we in all of our supply chains there are just like these random people that are a huge part of our supply chain, but just in terms of roles, responsibilities, how are we expected to protect our supply chain when we're dependent on, yeah, like you mentioned, just individuals somewhere?
And that's kind of the reason for the reactive approach or hardening approach, because you can't at some point you have to draw a line where you can separate your security and someone else's like security and their like what's their thing to do and what's your thing to do. So for example, for these individuals, so you're pulling a package from an individual, you kind of have to protect yourself from, okay, what if that person gets hacked, or what if this person suddenly decides they don't like us and want to attack us? How do we protect against that? So you have to take it from that approach, because you can't protect the individual. You have to protect yourself against the individual, kind of.
And do you think that we can effectively do that?
I don't think that everyone everywhere can effectively do it. I think that the big players can effectively do it. So like the big tech companies are able to do it because they have a lot of money, they have a lot of engineers, and they have a lot of they have the smartest people who are able to solve these issues. But even they have troubles as well, and they realize like, okay, if we are to protect our supply chain, we have to protect the supply chain of essentially everyone. So they've been very good in making open source contributions and adding open source tooling and frameworks to help with supply chain security.
Okay, let's go a little bit into that. So just open source as a concept, as a business, as a concept. If I'm reading this right, you're essentially saying that open source is essential. It is important. But it's also a bit risky. It's just inherent risk in that you just have these individuals supplying code to the global supply chain.
Yeah.
Can you
elaborate?
Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, there's some like base risks associated with open source, but is it? But the question is, isn't any different than the risks associated with, okay, you just bought a new solution from some company.
Some proprietary solution.
Yeah, some proprietary solution. It's closed source. You have no access to the code. Is that more or less risk that is in that? I think it's difficult to like completely compare the two, but I'd say it's just like an equal amount of risk. You have to approach it from the same way.
Do you think there are any like pros and cons, or is it just just a different way of doing things?
There are definitely pros and cons. With open source software, at least you have access to the source. So if you have security engineers or a security team in-house, you can at least review it for vulnerabilities, like unknown vulnerabilities, and then you can also very easily protect yourself against known vulnerabilities. But then the other issue is, okay, but everyone else has access to it as well and might contribute to it. So even if you trust this individual A that's maintaining the software, maybe at some point another person suddenly is interested in maintaining it for malicious reasons.
Absolutely. Um, just so that we can add a buzzword to this talk, do you think AI will help discover vulnerabilities maybe in the next 5 years?
Yeah, definitely, because it already has. There's already uh, solutions that are using LLMs to help them find vulnerabilities.
0 days?
Yeah, yeah. Just recently, just I believe yesterday, there was a pre-auth RC found in a software using an LLM. There are two companies which are like very much in this space, and they're doing some interesting stuff.
Okay, interesting. Okay, maybe a little bit onto some best practices. What can companies that are producing software or even if they are just consumers of any kind of software or packages or applications, what are the best practices that they can employ?
Yeah, I think there are so like I mentioned, supply chain security and like the approach to it is very difficult and it can be like very costly. But I think there are some small things here and there you can do which it like returns uh, a lot. So you can gain a lot from just these small tweaks that most people usually aren't doing. These are things like utilizing SCA tools like Dependabot or RenovateBot to help you figure out the known vulnerabilities and just patch them as soon as possible. Um, that can garner a lot of noise, but at least it helps a lot with just known vulnerabilities, and that usually also catches up on the malicious packages. Another thing which is kind of counterintuitive is not immediately updating can help. So if there's a new version of a package and it's not patching any critical or high vulnerabilities, you might consider waiting a bit. And it's kind of up in the air on how long you should wait, whether it should be 24 hours, 48 hours, or 30 days. But usually you want to wait a bit because if it's a suddenly a new released malicious version of the package, it's usually caught in a very timely manner.
But what if you're just a consumer of a service? We mentioned this before we started the talk, but software bill of materials, SBOM. That's a fairly common practice.
Yeah, and I believe like that is also a very helpful approach. So um, utilizing these SBOMs just to realize like, okay, what are we running? What do we have? And what are the dependencies of our dependencies? So we can figure out and try to be more proactive in protecting ourselves against these known vulnerabilities.
And how do you get those? If I'm just a consumer of a product, I don't know, we're using Figma or something. Are we then as a company supposed to ask for a software bill of materials from that company before we
Yeah,
become a customer?
yeah. That's one way. If they're not making it publicly available, then you can try and ask for it, and or try to make it a part of your agreement to get the SBOM. But maybe for Figma, which is a more of a SaaS solution, it maybe doesn't necessarily make sense. But if you're buying software which you're running on-prem, you'd be interested in knowing what it's actually running.
Doesn't matter if we're running it on-prem. What about just Amazon or Google or Azure?
Yeah, so in this case, I'm using on-prem as just like your infrastructure
Okay, okay.
on your internal network. Because, for example, the famous Log4j case. I don't know if you remember back then, but I remember that everyone knew of it, and everyone was running around trying to figure out if they were running Log4j somewhere, anywhere in their network or in their stack or any service that they were using. And it was very difficult for people to try and figure that out. And many people ended up creating these different scripts, which were just going through the jar packages that were on different systems. So then you had to go into all of the different systems and then try to scan for all of these. But if you had ASPOMs for everything, you would be able to know exactly where you're running Log4j.
All right, so we've been fairly technical. Okay, so there are still many different roles in the supply chain. So we've been sort of focused on software, but there are different roles, and one of that role is just the business leader. So how do business leaders, the CEOs, how do they approach this problem? Why is this important to them? Why is even the software aspect of it important?
Yeah, and here we're kind of going into compliance stuff and regulations. So, like we mentioned in the beginning of this, NIS2 and DORA, those regulations are kind of making it their issue because they're now the responsible parties if everything goes haywire. But how can they approach this? They can essentially just go the leadership route of making this a issue and making this part of the culture in-house, that this is something that we have to think about, this is something that we have to make sure is good. And if they're making the contracts, they're buying software from vendors, then they have to make sure that in the contracts they can try and force them to, okay, you're going to have to supply these things for us to ensure that we can trust you.
Okay. Can you go into maybe some kind of real world impact that, we could realize if we're not doing this sufficiently?
Yeah. There's the operational aspect. So if someone suddenly pulls a package from the registry that you don't have locally, or like you need to pull it every time you build, then the next time you're building, everything falls apart. So there's the kind of the availability issue that suddenly everything goes down. There's the issue of spying, or just the kind of the lucky hackers that are trying to just get any money they can with cryptocurrency. So they're just publishing a bunch of different malicious packages and then taking over other packages just to set up these cryptocurrency mining operations. And then the actually scary part is that someone is a part of your supply chain and is just lying in wait, and kind of is now a part of the internal network and now a part of the build process, and then has been able to go deep into your supply chain. And it's very scary. Like at one point, are you able to realize, like, okay, this person, we've been able to get them out of the supply chain completely, or did they were they actually able to dig themselves deeper in a spot where you weren't able to find them? That's kind of the SolarWinds approach.
Are you familiar with any concrete cases of this happening, for example, here in Iceland? And specifically maybe on the dependencies. So, you're just using some software and there's a dependency of a dependency that becomes malicious.
Yeah, I've had friends calling when they updated the package. So, and this is like the only in the wild ones that I know of is it's usually front end, so React, and it's a dependency of dependency where they've pulled something and it ended up just resulting in a cryptocurrency miner usually. So very lucky that it isn't anything like spectacularly bad.
But there were some cases of what was it? Visual Studio Code, some what were they? Extensions
Yeah,
that
and
were malicious.
yeah, and that's like in real world cases, just in generally or like worldwide, it's more each piece of software you use, which can be has these plugins or add-ons or anything, can be attacked. So, for example, like you mentioned, Visual Studio Code, the extensions on that platform can be used as a vector to get in.
So I think that's kind of interesting because, in my experience, we as companies we tend to focus most of our monitoring on the non-technical people, but it's a very interesting sort of vector to attack the people that we kind of tend to trust the most.
Yeah, and it's usually like I think people might have this association that okay, the tech people at my company, they're the least of my worries because they're the least likely to be the victims of phishing, as an example, because they're the like most technical as opposed to the HR people or the lawyers. But in reality, the technical people are usually like the most interesting people to attack, and usually can also be the easiest people to attack because they end up leaking stuff on the public internet, or they're using a lot of different tools which you can use as an entry point.
Very interesting. In your talk at Ytimesan, you mentioned Aftra, the Aftra case. So you found a vulnerability. So can you tell us a little bit about the vulnerability? Yeah, let's just start with that.
Yeah. I mentioned I was very lucky that you guys allowed me to talk about it publicly. So it was this one day where I was reviewing what repositories I had public on my profile, and I remembered. So I had forked a repository, an open source repository from Aftra, to make a joke commit, which included the backdoor, which obviously got ignored immediately. But I still had it on my public profile. But when I was looking at it, I noticed that the GitHub organization was renamed. So it went from Synthes software to being renamed to Aftra software. And I wasn't sure if I misremembered or something. So I sent you a message, I think immediately when I saw it. I was like, oh, did you rename the organization? And I think it happened just like 30 minutes before or something.
Yeah, it was kind of coincidental. Yeah.
Yeah. So it just happened to have been like that. But probably from your perspective, it looked like I was spying on you guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I then remembered that there's a known issue with GitHub where when you're renaming either a user or an organization, the GitHub has to do something with all of the software that's still pointing to the old name. So to ensure that nothing breaks, they make sure that people are forwarded to the correct organization or correct user.
So did we do anything wrong on that?
No. You guys as the consumer should just assume that everything works as intended, and it's not really your issue to try and fix. But I know it is actually recommended that when companies or users rename and they have something important, like some important repositories that they know a lot of people are polling, they should consider also registering the old name just to keep it.
Okay, so we were creating Aftra as a company, or had just recently done so, and we were renaming the software repository to be in alignment with the new name of the company. So we were using a very innocuous feature of GitHub, just to do the rename. And what happened was what? So, very simple terms. So, what was the sort of exploit?
Yeah. So then, because you made the rename, the old username is now available for registration. So I immediately registered the old name, and then that means that anyone that was still pointing to the old name because they might not know that you renamed it are now pointing to code that I control instead of code that you control.
Very interesting. And what are some possibilities that could have arisen from that vulnerability?
Yeah. So once I registered the username, I immediately looked at all of your open source repositories and just copied them over so they were the exact same because, of course, I didn't want to break anything as well. And then I reviewed all of the code and looked at what it was pulling and then where it was being deployed. So, for example, you have the Burp Suite collaborator server. So I realized, okay, that's probably going to be deployed on the on your internal network or some machines in AWS, which might be of interest because it's usually like a long-running job. So I added like backdoors into all of the different software. So it's still the exact same software that you guys had on your open source repositories with the added backdoor, which in this case was just a pingback, just to let me know that it actually worked. So it wasn't doing anything malicious. It just sent me a message like, "Hey, I'm running in this instance." But more interestingly is there was one open source repository you guys had, which is written in Go, and Go is an interesting language in that it doesn't pull packages from a registry. It just pulls packages straight from GitHub, and you were pointing at your own old name. So you had a package you were pointing to, which was the old name, which I now controlled, which meant that not only the open source repositories were pointing to it, there's probably also some internal repositories that are pointing to the same package. So I also decided to add to that specific package a pingback and ended up getting control of the build process. So I think 2 days later, I got a pingback which was running in a GitHub Actions on an internal repository. So then I had full control of that process, the build process.
So, okay, very interesting. On the first sort of follow-up question on that, so how did we as a team respond to when you let us know about this vulnerability?
Obviously, I knew you guys, so I realized you kind of had your heads in the screw done right, I guess. So I wasn't too afraid of reporting these issues to you guys. But you did correctly. Didn't sue me. We're happy to talk about it.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet. We're interested in like how it worked, so you could protect yourselves, and how, like, if there's anything you should have done differently. Which in this case is kind of weird because you did everything correctly. It's just a functionality that many people don't realize is there.
So how does that sort of reflect on us as a company in cybersecurity? We're creating a solution, a cybersecurity solution. Does it reflect poorly on us that we had the vulnerability, in your opinion?
No, definitely not. Everyone has vulnerabilities, and everyone has more vulnerabilities than they know of. So it doesn't reflect poorly on you guys because it's not any different from anyone else. The only difference is your response is a good and healthy response where it's like, yeah, you're not throwing the person with like the person with the message under the bus. You're interested in knowing more. You're interested in learning from this, and also like what you could do differently to protect from this in the future.
Is adverse feedback on receiving vulnerability notices, is that common in your...
Yeah, that can be common. I know a lot of people that were reporting issues but aren't reporting anymore because you don't get much from it. You just end up getting a lot of angry people pointed your way, or they might not take it seriously, which is also another aspect. So either you get the angry person back, or you get the nonchalant person back that is not interested at all, and it might be a super serious vulnerability that is uh, like of danger to their consumers. Um, so then it's kind of like what's your responsibility in that case?
Yeah. So transparency and maybe speed. Do you think that's important in this?
Definitely. Uh, Speed is good because you want to take a look at all logs you have just to make sure that nobody else has exploited this before. And then transparency can also be quite good, and just being open about it because obviously you're not the only company that's going to be renaming your organization on GitHub and running into these issues. There's probably a bunch of other companies that might run into the same issues. If they know that other people have had this issue, they can learn from that.
I think it's also maybe important to note that, maybe if anybody's listening, they shouldn't necessarily focus on this name change of GitHub. It's just a vulnerability, and that kind of vulnerability could potentially be present in whatever it is that you're doing, in any kind of software, any kind of solution.
Yeah, exactly. You can take the more abstract approach where it's like, okay, you had something pointing to X, and now it's no longer pointing there.
All right. If you could give anyone listening one sort of final piece of advice to secure their supply chain, regardless of whether it's software or something else, what would that be?
I guess take a look at the frameworks that have been made open. So, like Salsa, uh, it's pronounced Salsa, but it's an acronym which is SLSA. Take a look at that, see what is recommended, and it also outlines all the different threats and then how you can protect yourself against them. If you take a look at that, I think that's a great starting point because then you can realize, okay, I'm able to put the time and effort into doing X, Y, and Z.
So back to roles before we conclude this. Who in a company, what role in a company is responsible for doing that, and then maybe integrating it, up the layers, up to the C-suite? I'm sort of asking, how do we enable that kind of activity in a company so that it's actually meaningful? Because most of the time it's the CISOs.
Yeah. Someone within the company has to realize that this is an issue and then has to be able to make it an issue in-house and talk for it. They can point towards like if you're a person in a leadership role, it's easy. You just take the issue and then tell people that, okay, we have to fix this, we have to put effort into this, and you can talk for that. But if you're an engineer, so way lower in the chain, you have to kind of make an effort to make people realize why this is an issue and how this can be an issue. And in that case, you should just take known examples and show how that kind of mirrors on your infrastructure and how easy it can be.
Okay. I think that's all for now. I want to thank you for joining us. I think this is a really interesting discussion.
Thank you
thank
for
you.
having me.